Hi, I'm Lindsay, and welcome to my podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about different art movements that changed around the world at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, as well as how World War I impacted several art movements in several different countries at the same time. Because art is always ever changing and artists are trying new things to experiment with and trends shift and go through several different patterns every year, it's very rare for all of these different countries to have art that changes at the same time. It's very rare for all of these movements to align, and so that makes the period in time before and after World War I so unique and distinct, was because so many countries underwent the same change, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So what did art look like at the turn of the 20th century? Most art before this time, from the 1890s moving forward, was impressionist, which would be realistic in capturing real environments. Artists like Monet or Van Gogh can be cited from this period, and these artists didn't fixate so much on hyperrealism in their art, but rather capturing the environment that they were painting, and started this style called plein air, where people painted what they physically saw in front of them. But as the 1900s began, most large cities across the world started to see industrialization and modernization for the first time. The first skyscrapers were being built in large cities like Chicago, New York, and Paris, and the square-shaped architecture that we're very familiar with seeing today in most American cities was getting started for the first time. In France, in response to this modernity and repetition of these same shapes that didn't have any more decorative style, the Art Nouveau movement began. And with the Art Nouveau movement, there was this bridge between these linear shapes that we saw in most architecture that was developing, as well as these organic inspirations from plants or vines that was utilized in a lot of this art. A very popular artist from this time was Alphonse Mucha, and he was pretty much a frontrunner for the Art Nouveau movement. In most of his work, he was inspired by groups of four, and he would paint inspired by the seasons or different plants, and his work was very popular during this time. And with how popular the Art Nouveau movement was in France, several other countries started their own art movements that were also in response to modernity and industrialization. In Germany, an art movement that was very similar to Art Nouveau was called Jugendstil, or youth style. And the Jugendstil movement differentiates from the Art Nouveau movement in the different colors that it used. Jugendstil used a lot more bright, warm gold tones, while also keeping these very detailed and organic shapes that Art Nouveau had. A very famous artist from the Jugendstil movement is Gustav Klimt, and some of his most known pieces include The Kiss, that is very popular in pop culture today. Great Britain's version of a movement that was in a response to industrialization was called the Arts and Crafts movement. Because there were so many factories that were replicating the same thing over and over in Great Britain, the Arts and Crafts movement started by artists who made sure that each of their art pieces had a unique human touch. Their artwork was not meant to look like it could be easily replicable, but that every art piece that they made, whether in a series or not, looked different. It looked human-made and it looked man-made, and that was the fixation of Great Britain. But starting in 1912, Great Britain began to be inspired by a different art movement that was starting in Italy called the Futurist movement. The Futurist movement is credited to being started by an Italian poet named Filippo Tommaso Marinetti when he published his own Manifesto of Futurism in 1908. And a very interesting quote from this is when Marinetti writes that Italian artists will free Italy from her innumerable museums, which cover her like countless cemeteries. This attitude of wanting to reject the past was very similar for a lot of Italian artists at the time. Because Italy is always seen as a stronghold of traditionalism in art, whether it be from the Renaissance or forward, Italian artists felt like they were trapped in this box of an expectation that was set for them and the art that they created. They didn't want to look like the same artists that were popular 200 or 300 years prior, and so Futurism embraced these sort of modern shapes. They painted these skyscrapers and they painted these modern buildings that were starting to be built. And so Italy was unique in the fact that it embraced this modern society rather than reject it like most other countries did in Europe. But this fear of growing technology was very prominent, especially during the war, because new weapons were starting to be introduced as World War I began. Aircrafts were used for the first time, as well as mustard gas, the use of tanks, and automatic weaponry. And it was a level of destruction that people had never seen before or had ever expected to see in a war. Before World War II, World War I was just known as the Great War because people believed that it would be the war to end all wars. But as weapons that were much more destructive than anything in the past began, more and more people began to become disillusioned with World War I and didn't see it so much as a great war, but rather an example of their fears of industrialization becoming realized. People were no longer afraid of skyscrapers being constructed in large cities within their countries, but people began to understand that the growth in technology through weapons of war was something that was very difficult for people to process. For many artists that had been drafted and sent out to war, they returned home to an environment from the government that didn't support them or their fears or traumas that they experienced during war, and so many artists turned back to their own art to process the terrible things that they had witnessed. And this marks a global shift in art movements, which is very rare to occur. But for many of these countries that were affected by World War I, there was this huge shift from Impressionist art or like Art Nouveau style of organic and romantic shapes to this completely opposite end of the spectrum. In France, the Surrealist movement began, where art was never founded in reality anymore. Surrealist art was nonsensical and uncanny, and it was completely separate from the Impressionist style that was seen in the past. No longer did artists use references from things that they had actually seen, like in plein air paintings, but they painted things that didn't exist, and most artists pulled away from reality and drew into imagination as this sort of escape from what they had witnessed. And similar to the Surrealist movement in France, Germany began its Expressionism period, which marks a time that drew completely away from Impressionism of the past and started to use garish, unrealistic colors and very much ugly sort of muses and paintings that were very unsettling to the audience. A very famous artist from the Expressionist movement was an artist named Otto Dix, who after serving in the Battle of the Somme, which was the most deadly battle that was fought in World War I, he began to make a print series that he called Der Krieg, or The War, which was 50 different prints that he made, capturing different things that he'd witnessed in the Battle of the Somme. And most famously, what he depicted was a group of men wearing gas masks. For many German artists like Otto Dix, their art was a replica of what they had witnessed in war, and it was a glimpse for the first time into what people had actually experienced on the battlefield. Because Germany was left so impoverished after the end of World War I and having lost the war, Germany was very much unsympathetic to its soldiers, and so artists like Otto Dix and other expressionist artists were one of the only ways that people could get a glimpse into what was actually experienced on the battlefield, because for the German government, the loss of this war was a source of shame, and so it was very shameful to talk about the things that you had experienced. And so artists were one of the only outlets that Germany could use to show the problems that come with fighting such a violent war. And because so many German artists had such an influence over German society on whether it was pro or anti-war, when Hitler took power and tried to return Germany to war for World War II, he banned much modern art in the Expressionist movement, calling it degenerate art, and even went so far as to publicly mock artists of the Expressionist movement by putting their artwork into the Entartete Kunstmuseum, or the Degenerate Art Museum, where people could come in and mock these artists for talking about the war. And with this censorship of art, much that was made before World War II in Germany was direct propaganda for the country. And this not only occurred in Germany, but it also occurred in Italy. Following World War I, Italy experienced its second wave of the Futurist movement. However, this version of the movement embraced modernity, but it also embraced a very harmful style of nationalism for Italy. And with it, many Futurist artists ended up leading Italy towards electing its leader, Benito Mussolini, in 1922, who later obviously became a very powerful dictator. Overall, the art movements that existed before and after World War I show a shift in how artists were willing to portray the things that they were experiencing. Before World War I, most people's greatest fear was whether or not they should embrace this modern lifestyle, and so people focused more on this sort of lighthearted experience about being afraid of the future or the younger generations. And after World War I, many artists realized that modernization of architecture was not the biggest thing that they should have been afraid of, but they should have been afraid of this growth in technology and destructive power that had been amassed over time. Before World War I, art was very much impressionist, whereas afterwards it was very much expressionist. And it was one of the only times that globally art can be seen making a transition from one end of the spectrum to the other. And to me, it's very fascinating because it is so rare, But it also shows this change in people's perspectives on what modern life was. They were so afraid of this change toward this modern world that World War I was actually the catalyst that people could not return to before, because World War I was so destructive and violent. And because many people did not want to process this change, following World War I, these art movements that were expressionist started to shift towards the Roaring Twenties, and these very escapist mindsets that we're very familiar with in America also existed in cities like Paris and Berlin. It's really interesting in the ways that people tried to escape the war through their art and self-expression, only to be led through another cycle of disillusionment with the destructiveness of war in World War II. Overall, this period in time is very interesting because of such a rapid shift, and it should be a lesson into how people perceive modernization and a growth towards a new, unfamiliar future. So, thank you for listening. I hope this was at least mildly interesting. So yeah.